to begin our reflection with a question. Have you had a wilderness experience? Have you been in a wilderness? How do we define wilderness in the first place?
No Wi-Fi.
Right. No Wi-Fi, no Facebook, no social media.
Desert.
Desert.
Yes, yeah, I go for the woods.
Or the woods, yes.
No comforts,
No comfort, basically.
no security.
No security.
No friendly faces around to ask for help.
That's right.
Truth.
That's right, yes. It's so interesting that our reading, and perhaps Jose Luis, please feel free to help translate some of this to Daniel and
Él está diciendo
Exacto, yeah.
de que como antes la gente se comunicaba si no había ni wifi, no había ni todo lo que es la tecnología hoy en día, sino simplemente es cuando la gente cómo encontraba esa comunicación o se... Sí, también. Y ella dijo Facebook, pero ahora ya está avanzada la tecnología.
Gracias. And given our scripture, it's not a pleasant experience to be in the wilderness, no? As Jesus experienced it, the way Jesus experienced it. But it's so interesting that this season of Lent usually starts with this story, no? Wilderness experience. I think during this time, Jesus just wanted to have a retreat, you know, away from the daily routines. I mean, Jesus was also a full human. We all know that. And every day, at least for the last 3 years of his life, he had been doing his mission, you know, every day perhaps, always giving off himself to others. Teaching, healing, extending support, reprimanding the powers that be of the responsibility and accountability towards those who are poor, destitute, disenfranchised. So at this point, I think Jesus just wanted to have a retreat, to recharge, to reflect on his life and ministry. And in fact, it says that Jesus is taken up by the Spirit and transported to the wilderness. But then part of the experience of Jesus was that he was to be tempted as well. It's kind of hard to right away think that Jesus already knew that he's going to be tempted. I would like to interpret this by saying that he just wanted to have a retreat. As to how long the retreat would take him, I think he was not really thinking about it. Until perhaps without realizing that it already, and part of that retreat was fasting as well. Purging from all these quote-unquote worldly things. But then during this retreat, Jesus started also feeling alone, okay? For several days, maybe he was lost in the jungle with nothing to eat, no shelter, nothing to shelter him. And then he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 nights prior to the test. Can you imagine that? Maybe he was just eating something that he could find in the wilderness, whatever that would be. Number 40, by the way, is a significant biblical number. 40. Very important number. 40 years, the Israelites in the desert, on their way to Canaan, which is believed to be an entire generation. Jesus ascended to heaven after his resurrection or after his death, 40 days. And then after the fast, here in the wilderness, Matthew tells us that Jesus was hungry and vulnerable. And this is how the test began. How many of us have experienced really utter hunger? Huh? Okay, Lucy Louise, no? What happens? What happens when we just feel extremely hungry?
You get angry.
Huh?
You get angry.
Then you get angry. Huh?
Yep.
What happens? What happens?
I get up.
Huh?
I get up when I'm very hungry and I don't find my food, I get up.
Okay, what if there is no food available? You just happen to be in a place that you ran out of almost everything.
Drink water.
Then we become very exposed. Then we become very vulnerable. No?
Drink water.
Drink water, yes. But what if there is no water available?
There's another option. I saw the movie.
You have that.
There's another
About the
option.
10 cheeses
It's still
Okay.
to fill you.
water. It's still
Huh?
water. There's another, that movie, the guy that got lost in the mountain,
Oh,
that was caught in the canyon, and he didn't have any water, any food, so he drank his urine.
Yeah, that could be part, no? But then we pee because there is water in our body. But then once the body also dries up, this is a challenge. That's when there is that psychology of hunger. That once a person gets hungry, anything in his or her mind could happen. And then we start to fantasize as a way to escape our reality. Then we start to challenge whatever we have just to counter that feeling of hunger. And I think this was what Jesus actually went through. And according to Matthew, this was how the test began. So here, what we would like for us to reflect on this morning is simply to highlight 3 major lessons that we could learn from this reading. Number 1 is a test of priorities. Now, Jesus was challenged here. You know? For example, in verse 3, it says the devil, the tempter, appears to Jesus. I wish the author of the gospel describes the face of the devil. But it sounds like the devil is someone or something that goes against the will and purpose of God. And also in each of the tests that Jesus had to face, the tempter proposes ways for Jesus to claim and demonstrate his messianic role. So in the wilderness, Jesus was really tempted to maybe exert his being the Messiah. So the devil, according to the writer, appeals to Jesus with the words, if you are really the Son of God, if you're really the Son of God, you could just imagine perhaps, the experience that Jesus was really dealing with out of hunger, And what was the first proposition here? If you are really the Son of God, then command these stones to become loaves of bread. Loaves of bread. That's basically whenever we are hungry, we can think of any kind of food. That's how our body reacts. Any kind of food. And here, this is loaves of bread. That's why perform magic. If you are really the Son of God, perform some magic. Turn the stone into loaves of bread. At one level, the appeal relates to the immediate situation of Jesus' hunger after 40 days of fasting. At another level, the tempter poses the question of how Jesus will exercise his messianic power throughout his ministry. In other words, Jesus is asked to become a self-serving magician, wonder worker, flexing his power for his own needs. But then, the reply of Jesus makes clear that he is not about to act independently of God and use his power to gratify his own desires. To me, the proposal was even more tempting, especially when we think of those tens, millions of poor people in our community and throughout the world who do not have food on their table to eat. Sometimes we get tempted to play the messianic role and realize in the process that the person we actually serve are ourselves. That's really true. That's really true. Especially having that need, the need to help, the need to help. Sometimes we need to ask ourselves the question, who exactly are we trying to help here? Whose needs are we trying to cater? Is it really the needs of the people? Or our personal needs to help, to be recognized? That's why I always remind my students whenever we go to the Philippines, to Cambodia, to Rwanda, because right away they have that idea, oh, we're going there to help, which is, which resonates to the colonialist perspective of, here are these people from America, they are the Messiah, bringing all the help they could give, without necessarily establishing relationship with the people they are trying to reach out. And I think this resonates to Jesus' experience as well. And I remember a couple of my students before we went to the Philippines, right away, the question they asked is, how can we help? And then one of my Filipino colleagues told my students, if you really want to help us, go back to your country and educate your people about our situation here. If you really want to help us, go back to your country and write to your politicians and government leaders about international policies which are affecting our situation here. That kind of thing. Because sometimes in our attempt to help, we fail to actually establish a relationship with the people. And then we feel so good about ourselves for doing something for the people, not even in cooperation, in partnership with the local communities. And so we need to be mindful about that as well. To me, this is one lesson given our text this morning. Whose needs really are we trying to address? The test of priorities. And then the second lesson here is the test of confidence. On Matthew 4:5-7. For the second test, Jesus was invited to throw himself down. Some interpret this as a subtle attempt to get Jesus to destroy himself through false confidence. For others, it is an appeal to Jesus to seek public recognition for his work through miracle and magic. But Jesus was not deceived. Instead, he reminds his adversary that it is a mistake for us to try to force God's hand for personal vested interest. Can you imagine? If you're really the Son of God, then is it jump? No, just bow down, worship me. It's like submit yourself to any other power. And then the third lesson is the test of allegiance. What is allegiance? Loyalty. Matthew 4:8-10. Again, the scenery changed as the devil takes Jesus to a very high mountain for the third test. And for Matthew, mountains symbolize power and authority. Here the devil makes the offer, and the price he demands is Jesus' allegiance. But once again, Jesus refuses to succumb. He commands the devil to leave, depart, and reminds him of the basic teaching of Israel's faith, that only God deserves our worship and allegiance. Today, the world and everything in it mostly revolves around material possessions and objects. People are measured not anymore in terms of their character, ideals, and vision, including skills and abilities, but mainly by the money and material possessions they accumulate and possess. It seems like wealth has now become an end in itself. Success is now determined by how much investments we have made, particularly here in the United States. There is nothing inherently wrong with it until we do it at the expense of humanity. We all know that a person's worth is determined not by material possessions, but I'm afraid that this is what is ingrained in the psyche of the global market. Right here in the United States, the gap between the poor and the rich continues to grow bigger and bigger. People work all for themselves, all for personal and immediate gratification. Service and solidarity are no longer found in most of today's vocabulary. As one person told me at one point, she says, "I will work as long as it will bring me honor, prestige, and popularity." Can you imagine that? There's a growing number of young people, particularly in the Philippines, who are into showbiz, who just want to be popular, and they are willing to do what it takes just to get that fame. Are we making small gods out of these temporary material objects and possessions? Aren't these some of those images of temptation that Jesus rebuked? That because of our deep desire and hunger for power, fame, and prestige, we succumb to these temptations. So what are some of the challenges that we must face as we reflect on the Lent season? Some people would always remind us, what are some of the things you are willing to let go? But temporarily, just for this Lent season. Then after Lent season, back to reality. Instead really of making it, a sustainable change in our lifestyle, in the ways we think, in the ways we relate to people, First, there's the challenge of priorities, whether as an individual or as a family or as a faith community. What do we exactly prioritize at this point in our lives? In our career as adults or young adults, what do we value most in lives? Values, as we know, shape and influence the kind of life we live today and in the future. So how are we shaping this kind of culture, this kind of environment, this kind of world that we want to live in, that we want our children and our children's children to live? How are we influencing the kind of humanity we want the future generations to be a part of? There is so much to reflect on this Lent. And I hope that the experience of Jesus in the wilderness and his temptations will also become a focus for us as we observe this Lent season. And let us pray that God will continue to grant us patience and a listening heart to what the world is telling us we ought to do in bringing about peace and healing to ourselves, to our families, to our world. Amen.